nobody tells you about the Tuesday mornings. That is the part they leave out every single time. They tell you about the freedom, the sleeping in, the no more alarm clocks, the finally getting to do whatever you want. And, sure, all of that is real enough. But nobody pulls you aside before you walk out those doors for the last time and says, "Hey, listen, there is going to be a morning about 3 months in where you wake up at 6:15 out of pure habit, sit up on the edge of the bed in the dark, and realize with a clarity that hits you somewhere deep in the chest that you have got absolutely nowhere to be, not in a dramatic way, not the kind of thing that would worry anybody watching. Just that plain, quiet, honest feeling of a man who spent 50 years being needed somewhere and who is now, for the first time in his adult life, needed nowhere." I sat on the edge of that bed for a long time that morning. The room was dead quiet. Margaret was still asleep behind me. The dog hadn't moved. And I just sat there running through that mental checklist I had run every single morning for 38 years. The automatic scan, what's due today, who needs a call, what problem is waiting on me, and for the first time ever the scan came back completely empty. Nothing. Not a thing. And I kept waiting for that to feel like freedom. I kept waiting for that relief I had been promised. But it didn't feel like freedom. Not even close. It felt like a door had swung shut behind me that I hadn't heard closing. Here is the thing nobody warned me about. And I mean nobody. Not my doctor, not my financial advisor, not the guys I had worked alongside for decades, not a single person who slapped me on the back at that retirement dinner and told me I had earned this. They never told me that the hardest part of retirement has nothing to do with money or health or even loneliness exactly. The hardest part is waking up one ordinary morning and realizing that for the first time in your adult life, the world is getting along just fine without you. And once you see that, you cannot unsee it. I am 70 years old now, and what I am about to tell you is the honest version of what retirement actually feels like from the inside. The version nobody puts in the brochure. The version I had to learn the hard way, sitting alone in a quiet house wondering where in the heck I had disappeared to. I started working at 22 years old, fresh out of a state university in western Pennsylvania, with a degree in civil engineering and enough ambition to make up for what I lacked in experience, which in those early days was considerable. My first job was with a mid-sized infrastructure firm outside of Pittsburgh, the kind of company that did bridge assessments and road projects and municipal contracts, unglamorous work by most measures, but work that felt substantial and real in a way I appreciated even then. I liked that the things I worked on existed in the physical world. I liked that you could drive past a bridge and know that you had done the calculations that kept it standing. There was a solidity to that which fed something in me that I think had always been there. Some need to build things that mattered, to contribute to something larger than myself in a way that left a mark you could see and touch and point to. My father had been a steel worker for 30 years, and though our work was different in almost every practical way, I think I inherited from him that basic working man's value system, the belief that a man's worth was demonstrated through what he produced, through showing up and doing the job well and not making a fuss about it. That idea was so deeply embedded in me by the time I entered the workforce that I never questioned it, never held it up to the light and examined it, never asked whether it was the only way to measure a life. I just accepted it as true and built my entire existence around it for the next 4 decades. By the time I was 30, I had changed companies once and moved my young family from Pittsburgh to Columbus, Ohio, following a better opportunity with a larger engineering and project management firm that handled state and federal infrastructure contracts across the Midwest. The pay was meaningfully better, and the scope of the work was larger, and I threw myself into it with a kind of focused intensity that I now understand was not entirely about ambition. Some of it was ambition, certainly, but some of it was also the simple fact that work was the place where I knew exactly who I was and exactly what was expected of me, and that clarity felt like safety in a way I did not consciously recognize at the time. Margaret and I had married when I was 25, a good and steady woman who had grown up in a small town outside of Erie and who had her own quiet strength that I leaned on more than I ever properly acknowledged during those years. We had 3 children, our oldest son Patrick, our daughter Renee, and our youngest Tom, and they grew up in a 4-bedroom house in a suburb of Columbus, with a good school district and a yard big enough for a swing set and a vegetable garden that Margaret tended with a patience and care that I admired and rarely helped with. I was present in the house in the physical sense during those years, but I want to be honest about what present actually meant. It meant I was home most evenings by 6:30 or 7. It meant I was there on weekends more often than not, though the weekends had a habit of being interrupted by work calls and emails that I told myself were unavoidable, and that I now understand was sometimes a choice I was making without fully owning the choice. I coached Patrick's Little League team for 2 seasons when he was 9 and 10, and those Saturday mornings on the diamond are some of the memories I hold most carefully now. The smell of the infield dirt and the sound of aluminum bats and the way the boys would argue about the rules with a seriousness that was completely disproportionate to the stakes involved. I was good at the coaching in a way I was good at most things that involved organizing people toward a shared goal, and I loved it, and I wish I had done more of it. But the project deadlines and the travel schedule and the general relentlessness of a career that was always asking more of me made it easy to let the seasons slip by without signing up again. And 2 seasons became the whole of my coaching career, and Patrick grew up and stopped needing a coach. And that window closed, the way windows close when you are not paying close enough attention. My career progressed in the way careers do, when you are capable and consistent and willing to work harder than the people around you. By my early 40s, I was a senior project manager overseeing multiple large infrastructure projects simultaneously, managing teams of engineers and contractors and subcontractors and navigating the particular bureaucratic complexity of government contracts with a competence that I was genuinely proud of. By 50, I was a director, and by 55, I was a vice president of operations for the firm's Midwest division, a title that came with a corner office and a salary that would have been unimaginable to the 22-year-old who had shown up in Pittsburgh with his brand new degree and his father's work ethic and no real understanding of how large a life could become if you kept showing up and kept pushing forward. The work was hard and demanding, and occasionally maddening, and I loved it in the way you love something that fits you, that requires exactly the combination of skills and temperament you happen to possess, that puts you in a room where your presence makes a difference. I loved the complexity of it, the problem-solving, the management of people and resources and timelines, the satisfaction of a project completed on budget and on schedule. I loved the rhythm of the days, the early mornings and the full calendars and the sense of forward motion that a demanding career provides, that constant feeling of moving through something important. What I did not understand, not then, not until it was too late to matter in the practical sense, was that I had built my entire sense of self inside that career the way you build a house inside a canyon. The walls of the canyon felt like part of the house. They felt permanent and structural and load-bearing. And they were, right up until the day I walked out of that building for the last time and discovered that what I had taken for walls was just the world, and the world had no particular interest in holding me up once I was no longer useful to it. I want to tell you about the picture I carried in my head for the last decade of my working life, because I think it is important to understand how clearly and completely I had imagined retirement before it arrived, and how differently the reality presented itself when it finally did. The picture had been forming for years, built up gradually from 1,000 small daydreams stolen during long meetings and late nights at the office and early morning drives to job sites in the gray Ohio winter, and by the time I was in my early 60s, it was a complete and detailed image that I could call up with very little effort. In the picture, I was unhurried. That was the central quality of it, the thing that made it feel most like a reward after so many years of being perpetually rushed. I was a man with nowhere to be by a specific time, a man who could let the morning develop at its own pace, without one eye always on the clock. I imagined long breakfasts with Margaret, real breakfasts with eggs and toast and juice and conversation that didn't have to end because someone had a 7:30 call. I imagine reading the newspaper all the way through instead of scanning the headlines while standing at the kitchen counter with my coat already on. I imagined Saturday mornings that felt like Saturday mornings instead of just slightly less pressured versions of weekdays. Beyond the mornings, I had a list of things I was going to do with the time that retirement would give back to me, and the list was long enough and specific enough that I sometimes went over it in my head during flights, mentally checking items off before I had even begun them. Margaret and I had talked for years about traveling to places we had never made time for during our working years. Ireland, because her grandmother had come from County Clare, and she had always wanted to see it, and Alaska, because I had read something about it in a magazine 20 years ago, and the idea had never entirely left me. We talked about a long road trip through the American Southwest, national parks and red rock country, and the kind of open landscape that reminds you how large the world actually is. I was going to fish more. I had grown up fishing with my father on small Pennsylvania lakes and streams, and had always loved it. The particular combination of patience and attention and outdoor stillness that fishing requires, and I had let it almost entirely lapse during my career, except for the occasional weekend trip that was more about the idea of fishing than the actual doing of it. In retirement, I was going to fish properly, regularly, with good equipment, and no phone buzzing in my vest pocket, and nowhere else to be when the afternoon light started going golden across the water. I was going to spend more time with the grandchildren. Patrick had 2 kids by the time I retired, a girl named Sophie who was 8, and a boy named Connor who was 5, and Renee had a daughter named Lily who had just turned 6, and I had been the kind of grandfather who showed up for birthdays and holidays and occasional Sunday dinners, present and affectionate, but not deeply embedded in their daily lives in the way I had always vaguely intended to be. Retirement was going to change that. I was going to be the grandfather who was actually available, who could pick them up from school on a Tuesday and take them to the park and teach Connor to fish and help Sophie with her reading and be genuinely present in their lives in a way that my career had never allowed me to be present in the lives of my own children. I also told myself I would slow down physically in a healthy way, meaning I would walk more and sit less, would get outside every day regardless of the weather, would lose the 15 pounds that had settled around my middle during the sedentary years of sitting in meetings and eating airport food and working through lunch at my desk. I had vague intentions about a vegetable garden of my own, about fixing things around the house that had been on the list for years, about learning something new, maybe woodworking or photography or some other skill that had nothing to do with project management or infrastructure contracts. The retirement party was in April, a Friday evening at a nice restaurant downtown, about 40 people, colleagues and friends and family, and it was genuinely warm and well-intentioned, and I felt celebrated in a way that was real and not performative, and Margaret sat beside me the whole evening, looking proud in a way that meant something to me. My boss of 14 years gave a speech that was thoughtful and specific, and that referenced real things we had been through together, and when he finished there was sustained applause, and I stood up and said a few words that I had prepared, but that came out sounding more spontaneous than prepared, which was what I had been going for, and people laughed in the right places, and there were some genuine moments of emotion, and it was, by every measure, a good send-off. I drove home that night with Margaret beside me in the passenger seat, and the windows down a little because it was a mild April evening, and I felt satisfied and grateful and quietly excited in the way you feel at the beginning of something you have been anticipating for a long time. The first week was everything I had imagined. I slept until 7, which felt luxurious beyond description. I made a real breakfast 2 mornings in a row. Margaret and I took a long walk through the neighborhood on a Wednesday afternoon and stopped to look at things we had never paused long enough to look at before. A garden someone had put in along their fence line, a hawk sitting on a telephone wire watching the street below with magnificent indifference. I felt the physical unwinding of decades of accumulated tension in a way that was almost tangible, a loosening in my shoulders and my jaw and the back of my neck that I had forgotten was even possible. I thought, this is it. This is exactly what I needed, and I was grateful for it and certain that the picture I had carried in my head for all those years was going to match the reality that was just now beginning to unfold. I was certain of that all the way through the first week and most of the second. It was somewhere in the third week that the picture started to develop a quality it had never had in my imagination, a quality I did not have a word for at first, and that I kept trying to reframe as something manageable and temporary. The word I eventually found for it was hollow. The days had begun to feel hollow in a way that the picture had never accounted for, and I did not know yet what to do with that. So I did what I had always done with things I did not know what to do with, which was to set it aside and tell myself it would sort itself out in time. It did not sort itself out in time. It got more specific. The first sign, if I am being precise about it, was the mornings. Not the first few mornings of retirement, which had that quality of stolen pleasure, of sleeping past the alarm that wasn't set, and waking without urgency and lying there in the quiet, with a sense of having gotten away with something enjoyable. Those early mornings were fine, better than fine. The first sign came later, maybe 3 weeks in, when the novelty of the unhurried morning had worn off, and what was left underneath it was just the morning itself, long and unstructured and indifferent to whether I engaged with it meaningfully or not. I would wake at 6 or 6:15 out of pure biological habit, the body's 40-year memory, refusing to accept that the schedule had changed. And I would lie there in the bedroom, looking at the ceiling in the early gray light, and run through the mental check that I had performed every morning for decades, the automatic scan for what the day required. What was due, what needed my attention, who I needed to call, what problem was waiting. And the scan would come back empty. Nothing due. Nothing waiting. Nobody expecting anything from me by any particular time. And instead of feeling like freedom, which is what I had always assumed it would feel like, it felt like standing in a room where all the furniture had been removed. The room was the same room. The walls and the ceiling and the floor were all exactly where they had always been, but something essential had been taken out of it, and the space where that something had been was now just space, and space without content has a quality to it that is closer to absence than to peace. I started getting up earlier than I needed to simply because lying in bed with that empty scan felt worse than being vertical and moving. I would go downstairs and make coffee, and stand at the kitchen window and watch the neighborhood come into the morning light. The birds at the feeder Margaret had put up near the back fence, the way the light moved across the yard as the sun came up behind the house, the occasional car going past on the street out front, someone with somewhere to be at 6:30 in the morning, and I would watch that car and feel something that I am slightly embarrassed to admit feeling, which was envy. I was envious of people going to work. I'd spent 38 years fantasizing about not going to work, and now I was standing at my kitchen window, envying the people who were. I kept that to myself for a long time because it seemed like the kind of thing that would worry Margaret unnecessarily, and also because it seemed, frankly, ungrateful, the complaint of a man who had everything he was supposed to want and was finding reasons to be dissatisfied with it anyway. The phone was the second sign. During my working years, my phone had been an extension of my hand, practically a biological appendage, buzzing and lighting up from before 7 in the morning until well into the evening. A constant stream of emails and texts and calls that sometimes exhausted me, and that I had occasionally fantasized about throwing into a lake. In retirement, the phone went quiet in a way that I had not anticipated, and that I found deeply unsettling in a way I struggled to rationalize. The work contacts stopped reaching out almost immediately, which I understood and did not hold against anyone, because that is simply how the professional world operates. You are in the current or you are not, and I had stepped out of the current voluntarily, and the current had closed behind me with the efficient indifference of moving water. But even personal contacts, friends from the industry, men I had known for decades and eaten lunch with hundreds of times and navigated difficult projects alongside, even those connections thinned out faster than I expected. There were warm messages in the first couple of weeks, the usual retirement congratulations, and we should get together soon, and you earned this, and I responded to all of them with genuine warmth and meant it when I said yes, let's get together, and then the getting together mostly did not happen, and the messages mostly did not continue, and by the end of the first month, my phone was spending long stretches of the day sitting on the kitchen counter in complete silence, and I would find myself glancing at it with a frequency that I recognized as slight pathetic and could not entirely stop. Margaret noticed, I think, in the quiet, observant way she notices most things about me. But she was careful about how she approached it because she knows that I respond poorly to feeling managed, and I was grateful for the care even as I was aware that the care itself was a form of acknowledgement that something was off. The empty afternoons were the hardest part of those early weeks. I had not anticipated the afternoons specifically. I had thought about the mornings and the evenings and the overall shape of the retired day in my pre-retirement imaginings, but the specific quality of a Tuesday afternoon in retirement was something I had not adequately prepared for. By 2 or 3 o'clock on any given weekday, I would have exhausted whatever modest task or errand I had given myself for the day, and the afternoon would stretch out ahead of me in this flat and featureless way that made every minute feel slightly longer than it should. I took to driving in the afternoons, just getting in the car and going somewhere with no particular destination. Sometimes to a hardware store to look at things I did not need, sometimes to a park on the east side of the city where there was a walking path around a small lake, sometimes just along the suburban streets of our neighborhood, and the neighborhoods around it, watching people move through their days with the ordinary purposefulness of people who have somewhere to be and something to do. I was not depressed. I want to be clear about that, or at least I did not believe I was, and I still do not think that word fully captures what I was experiencing. It was something quieter and more specific than depression, something that lived in the particular space between what I had expected retirement to be and what it was actually turning out to be, and it expressed itself not in any dramatic way, but in a series of small and mundane moments that each seemed manageable on their own, but that were accumulating into something I could feel the weight of. I drove past my old office building one afternoon without planning to, just ended up on that street the way you sometimes end up somewhere familiar without consciously heading there, and I slowed down as I passed it and looked at the parking lot and the entrance and the windows of the floor where my office had been, and some of the lights were on up there, and behind those lit windows people were doing the work that I had done for 14 years, and the building looked completely the same as it always had, completely unchanged, completely indifferent to my absence, and I drove past it and kept going and did not go back. It came to me in stages, the way most important things come to you when you are older and have learned, whether you wanted to or not. The clarity rarely arrives all at once, but tends instead to accumulate gradually, the way water accumulates in a low place after a long rain, slowly and without drama, until one morning you look and realize it has become something significant. The first stage happened at Patrick's house on a Sunday in late October, about 4 months into retirement. One of those Ohio fall days where the air has that particular sharp clarity to it that makes everything look slightly more defined than usual, the colors of the leaves and the edges of the rooftops and the pale blue of the sky all seeming to have been outlined in something precise and clean. Margaret and I had driven over for Sunday dinner, a tradition that Patrick and his wife Karen had established after I retired and that I had come to look forward to with an eagerness that I recognized was partly about the genuine pleasure of being with family and partly about the simple relief of having somewhere specific to be on a Sunday afternoon. We arrived around 4, and the house was warm and full of the smell of something Karen had been cooking since early afternoon, and Sophie and Connor were in the backyard doing something that involved a lot of running and periodic shouting and the general, magnificent chaos of children who have not yet learned to be self-conscious about their own energy. I went out back to watch them for a while, and Connor, who was 5, and at that age where grandfathers are still genuinely exciting rather than merely tolerated, came running over and grabbed my hand and pulled me toward the yard with the complete physical confidence of a child who has never considered the possibility that the adult he is pulling might not want to be pulled, and I went with him willingly, and we spent about 20 minutes in the backyard throwing a foam football back and forth, while Sophie organized some separate and apparently more sophisticated game nearby that she explained to me in great detail and that mostly failed to nod Rick on. And for those 20 minutes, I was completely present in a way that I had not been completely present in anything since I retired. not managing the moment or monitoring myself within it or aware of the time passing, just there, in the yard, in the October light, throwing a foam football with my 5-year-old grandson. And then Karen called them in to wash up for dinner, and Connor dropped the ball and ran for the back door without a backward glance in the way that children do, all forward motion and zero sentimentality. And I stood there in the yard alone, holding the foam football in the present strained out of the moment as quickly as it had filled it. And I was back inside my own head again, aware of the quiet and the fading afternoon light, and the fact that dinner would be over an hour or two. And then we would drive home, and the evening would tive, and the morrow would be Monday, would look exactly Sunday had looked at Tuesday. I went inside and we had dinner, and it was warm and good, and the children were funny in the way children are funny, when they are still young enough to be completely unfiltered, and I laughed genuinely and felt the warmth of the table and was grateful for it. But on the drive home, something was sitting with me that I could not put down. Something about those 20 minutes in the yard with Connor that I kept turning over in my mind without quite being able to articulate what it was I was turning over. It was not until I was lying in bed that night, the house quiet and Margaret asleep beside me, that I found the words for it, or the beginning of the words for it, which was this. For 20 minutes in that backyard I had been needed. Not needed in any grand or consequential sense. Not needed the way I had been needed in conference rooms and on job sites and in the middle of project crises, but needed in the simple and immediate and entirely real sense of a child who wanted to throw a football with someone and had chosen me specifically, and the choosing had mattered to me in a way that I found disproportionate, and that I lay in the dark examining with the careful attention of a man trying to understand something about himself that he is not entirely comfortable with. The second stage came about 3 weeks later, in a form so ordinary and undramatic that I am almost reluctant to describe it because it will sound like nothing, like the kind of small domestic moment that passes unremarked in the course of any given day. I had been trying for several days to get the latch in our side gate to work properly. It had been sticking for months, and I had finally decided to take it apart and see what the problem was, and I spent an afternoon in the driveway with a screwdriver and a small collection of replacement hardware from the hardware store, and I fixed it, properly and completely, a job that took maybe 2 hours, and that at the end of it left the gate opening and closing, with a smooth and satisfying click that it had not had in over a year. I stepped back and opened and closed it 3 or 4 times just to feel the click, the way you do when you affix something that was broken, and I felt a disproportionate satisfaction that I recognized immediately as the same thing I had felt in the backyard with Connor, that brief and clarifying sensation of having done something that needed doing, of having applied myself to a problem and resolved it, of having been, in some small and localized sense, useful. And standing there in the driveway clicking the gate latch, I understood something that I think I had been circling around for 4 months without letting myself land on it directly, which was that usefulness had been the organizing principle of my entire adult life, more fundamental even than ambition or identity or any of the other words I might have used to describe what drove me, and that retirement had not simply removed my job, but had removed the primary context in which I was able to experience myself as useful, and that the loss of that context was what the hollow mornings and the long feederless have bone. At all. The third stage, the one that completed the realization and gave it its full weight, happened on a Tuesday morning in November when I drove to the office supply store to pick up something Margaret needed and ran into a man named Richard Gallagher, who had worked under me for 11 years at the firm and who was now, I knew from the occasional industry news that still reached me, running the division I had once run. Richard was warm and genuine pleased to see me. But net a retirement, it's a retirement with you and me timing, bive. But Chima and Sands which round, it is quant to someone who has left a world, they are still fully inside, and I said fine, great, really enjoying the time, which was the answer I always gave because it was the answer that required the least glan, required the least concern, and was the netter to nodded and said that was great, and that everyone at the firm missed me and that division was keeping him busy, and he said the last part with a slight roll of the eyes and grin, but tithe, it is spount, it's that it bite so. And I recognized that expression because I had worn it myself for 30 years. and standing there in the fluorescent light of an office supply store watching Richard Gallagher wear it, I felt the full and unambiguous weight of what I had lost. Not the job, not the title, not the salary, but that feeling, that specific and irreplaceable feeling of being a man with more to do than hours to do it, in a man whose presence in the world was required by something real and consequential and ongoing. I drove home from the office supply store and sat in the car in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside, not doing anything, just sitting, and I thought about my father and whether he had felt this when he retired from the steel plant after 30 years, and I thought he probably had. And I wished again that I had asked him when I still could, and I sat there in the car, in the driveway of my house in the quiet November morning, feeling the full and honest weight of a realization that had taken 4 months to complete itself, and that I now understood was not going to resolve, in I bait. I want to try to describe what the days actually felt like during that period, the specific texture of them, because I think the broad strokes are easy enough to understand from the outside. But the details are where the real weight lives, and I think anyone who has been through something similar will recognize the details even if the surface circumstances were different from their own. I was not falling apart. I want to establish that clearly at the outset, because I think there is a tendency when telling a story like this to reach for the more dramatic version of events, the version where the protagonist is visibly crumbling in ways that are apparent to everyone around him. That was not my experience. My experience was quieter and more internal than that, a steady low-grade difficulty that expressed itself not in breakdowns or visible distress, but in the accumulated weight of ordinary days that had lost their organizing principle and had not yet found a new one. I got up every morning. I made coffee. I read the news. I took a walk most days, sometimes short and sometimes longer, depending on the weather and my inclination. I did the tasks that needed doing around the house, the maintenance and the errands and the small repairs that had been accumulating for years during my working life, and that I now had more than enough time to attend to. From the outside, I imagine I looked like a man settling comfortably into retirement, moving at a slower pace and filling his days with the ordinary activities of an older man with time on his hands. From the inside, it was a different experience entirely. The mornings had a quality that I came to think of as the gray hour, not because of the light, though the Ohio winter light did have that quality much of the time, but because of the feeling that accompanied the first part of every day, that flat and slightly muffled quality of hours that have no particular destination. I would sit at the kitchen table with my coffee and the newspaper, and I would go through the motions of a morning, reading the sports section and the local news and the opinion pages, and occasionally something would catch my genuine interest and hold it for a while, but more often I was reading in the way you watch television when nothing good is on, not because you are engaged, but because it is better than the alternative, which was sitting in the silence of the kitchen with nothing between me and the awareness of how slowly the morning was moving. Margaret left the house most mornings by 9 or 9:30, her book club and her volunteer work at the hospital gift shop and her standing Tuesday lunch with her friend Diane and the various other commitments and social structures that she had built over decades of managing her own time intelligently. And after she left the house, would settle into a silence that I never entirely got comfortable with. It was not the silence itself that was difficult. I want to be precise about that, because silence is not inherently a problem, and I had never been a man who needed constant noise around him. What was difficult was what the silence contained, which was an absence, the absence of the purposeful forward motion that had characterized every day of my adult life for nearly 4 decades, and the absence had a presence of its own, a weight and a texture that I was aware of in the way you are aware of, a low, persistent sound that you cannot locate the source of. I started doing things to fill the hours that I would not have done during my working years, and that I would not have predicted I would do in retirement, things that I recognized even as I was doing them as displacement activities rather than genuine engagements. I reorganized the basement over the course of 2 full weeks, sorting and labeling and arranging with a thoroughness that the basement probably did not require, and that produced a result, that was genuinely impressive and that I felt satisfied with for approximately one afternoon before the satisfaction faded, and the basement was simply the organized basement, rather than the project that had been giving my days a structure. I watched more television than I had watched in my entire adult life combined, which bothered me in a way I found difficult to articulate, because it was not the television itself that was the problem, but what the watching of it represented, which was a man filling time rather than spending it, a man whose relationship with the hours of the day had shifted from one of managed scarcity to one of embarrassed surplus. I watched the news in the morning and old movies in the afternoon and whatever Margaret wanted to watch in the evening, and I retained almost none of it. Because I was not really watching, I was simply allowing the screen to occupy the space in front of my eyes while my mind did what it had begun doing with increasing frequency, which was to turn inward and circle around the same questions without arriving at satisfying answers. The physical awareness of aging intensified during this period in a way that I attribute, at least partly, to the removal of the forward momentum that work had always provided. When you are busy and purposeful and moving through a demanding professional life, the body's signals tend to get filtered through the noise of the activity, not ignored exactly, but not dwelt upon, registered and set aside in favor of the more pressing demands of the day. In retirement, with the noise gone and the days quiet and the hours long, the body's signals became harder to set aside. I noticed the stiffness in my lower back when I got up from the couch, the way my knees complained on the stairs in the morning before I had been moving long enough to loosen them up, the reading glasses that I now needed for anything closer than arm's length, including the newspaper I read every morning, the way I tired more easily than I used to on the longer walks and needed more recovery time than I expected after any physical exertion beyond the ordinary. None of this was dramatic or medically significant. My doctor was not concerned and my checkups were unremarkable for a man of 66. But in the quiet of the retired days, I was aware of my body in a new and more intimate way, aware of it as a thing that was aging on its own schedule, regardless of my preferences, and the awareness had an emotional dimension to it that was not exactly fear, but was in the same neighborhood as fear, a recognition of finitude that the busyness of a working life had always kept at a comfortable remove. I felt invisible in public in a way that was new, and that I found more unsettling than I expected to find it. This is something that I have hesitated to say out loud because it sounds like vanity, and maybe there is an element of vanity in it, but I think it is also something real and worth naming. During my working years, I had moved through public spaces with a certain quality of presence. Not arrogance, I hope not arrogance, but the natural confidence of a man who knows his place in the world and occupies it without apology. In retirement, that quality seemed to have thinned out, and I began to notice that I was moving through the world with a different kind of visibility, the kind that older men have when they are no longer embedded in any professional or social structure that signals their relevance to the people around them. At the hardware store and the grocery store and the gas station and the doctor's office waiting room, I was simply an older man, unremarkable and interchangeable, and the world moved around me with the efficient indifference it shows to anyone who has stepped back from the machinery of things. I did not need strangers to recognize me. I want to be clear about that. But there is a difference between not needing recognition and not feeling the texture of its absence, and the texture of its absence was something I felt with a specificity that surprised me, and that I carried quietly through those long months without mentioning it to anyone, because it seemed like the kind of thing that would sound small and self-pitying when spoken aloud, even though it did not feel small from the inside. The nights were their own particular difficulty. I had always been a decent sleeper during my working years, the kind of man who was tired enough by 10 o'clock that sleep came quickly and held until the alarm, the body's demand for rest keeping pace with the day's expenditure of energy. In retirement, with the days less physically and mentally demanding, sleep became less reliable, and the nights became longer in the subjective sense, the sense of lying in the dark while the hours move slowly and the mind, with nowhere purposeful to go, went to the places minds go when they are unsupervised in the small hours of the morning. It went to the past more than I was comfortable with, reviewing choices and moments and the accumulated record of a life lived largely at full speed, and in the dark quiet of 3 in the morning. That record had a different quality than it had in daylight, a starker and more honest quality that did not always reflect well on the man who had made the choices and been present for the moments. And I would lie there with Margaret breathing steadily beside me, and the house completely silent around us, and feel the weight of decades in a way that the daylight hours, even the difficult ones, did not quite produce. There's a particular kind of thinking that retirement makes possible, and that working life, by its nature, makes nearly impossible. And that is the thinking that goes all the way back, that has the time and the stillness to return to specific moments and examine them with a care and an honesty that the forward motion of a busy life never allows. During my working years, I had always been oriented toward what was coming. The next project and the next deadline and the next quarter and the next year, and the past had existed mostly as context for the present, rather than as a place worth visiting in its own right. In retirement, the past became more present than the present in certain ways, rising up in the quiet of the long days with a specificity and a weight that I had not been prepared for, and that I did not always know what to do with. I want to talk about my children first, because they are the place where the regret lives most specifically and most honestly, and I think the honest version is more useful than the softened version, even though the honest version is harder to say. Patrick is 40 now, a good man, steady and capable, and kind in ways that I think came more from Margaret than from me, and we have a solid relationship now, warm and regular and real. But I think about the years when he was growing up. The specific years between 8 and 16 that I now understand were the years that mattered most in terms of what a father's presence can mean to a boy. And I know with a clarity that I did not have at the time that I was not as present during those years as I should have been, and as he needed me to be. I was there in the physical sense more often than not. I was in the house most evenings, and at the table for dinner most nights, and at the important events, the school plays and the graduation ceremonies and the big games. But being in the room is not the same as being present in the room, and I was a man who brought the office home with him in ways that were not always visible, but were always felt, the distraction and the preoccupation and the sense that some part of my attention was always reserved for something that was not happening in the room I was actually in. Patrick went through a difficult stretch in his early teens, a period of withdrawal and sullenness that I now understand was a fairly normal adolescent response to feeling that his father was not fully available to him, and I responded to that withdrawal with a combination of patience and puzzlement and occasional frustration that I am not proud of, trying to manage my son the way I manage problems at work, looking for the efficient intervention that would resolve the situation and restore equilibrium, and missing entirely the simpler and more obvious thing that was needed, which was just more of my time and my willingness to sit with him in the difficulty without drawing to Gasuki. We came through it without permanent damage, Patrick and I, but I think about that period sometimes, and I think about what it cost him to have a father who was good at his job and mediocre at being present, and the thinking does not make me feel good about myself in a way that I think is appropriate and that I accept as part of the honest accounting of a life. Renee is 37 and lives in Denver with her husband and their daughter Lily, and the distance is partly geographic and partly something else, something that has its roots in her childhood and that she has never addressed with me directly, and that I have never addressed with her directly, because we are both people who tend to hold difficult things internally rather than bringing them out into the open where they might require something of us. Renee was a sensitive child, perceptive and emotional in ways that I did not always know how to meet, and I think she understood earlier than either of her brothers that I was more comfortable with the professional version of myself than with the version that was required by genuine emotional intimacy, and I think that understanding shaped her relationship with me in ways that persisted into her adulthood. She calls every couple of weeks, and the calls are warm enough on the surface. We talk about Lily and about what is happening in Denver and about the ordinary facts of each other's lives. But there is a layer underneath the warmth that we have never gotten to, a layer of things unsaid that I am aware of every time we talk and that I suspect she is aware of too. And I do not know at this point in my life whether the getting to it would do more good than the leaving of it alone. And that uncertainty is itself a form of the regret trying to decide. With Tom, my youngest, the situation is simpler and in some ways harder. Tom and I were close when he was small, closer than I was with Patrick or Renee during their early years, partly because by the time Tom was young, I had reached a level in my career where the most brutal travel demands had eased somewhat, and I was home more consistently, and partly because Tom had a temperament that was easier for me to connect with, a practical and good-humored boy who liked to fix things and build things and who responded well to the kind of side-by-side companionship that I was better at providing than the face-to-face emotive availability that Renee had need. Tom and I built a workbench together in the garage when he was 11, and I still think of that Saturday as one of the best days of my fatherhood. The two of us out there with the lumber and the tools and the radio going, and nothing required of either of us except the work and the company. But Tom moved to Phoenix after college and built a life there that is full and busy and that does not have a great deal of room in it for a father who is now a 1,500-mile plane ride away. And our relationship has thinned with the distance in the way that relationships do when geography and the demands of adult life are allowed to do their slow work on them. I talk to Tom maybe once a month, shorter calls than the ones with Renee, practical and affectionate but not deep. And I feel the thinness of it, and I know that I could do something about it if I tried harder, and I also know that trying harder at 66 is a different and more complicated proposition than it would have been at 46, when there was still enough shared daily life between us to give the relationship texture and substance beyond the occasional phone call. Margaret and I have talked about some of this. Not all of it, not the deepest parts, but enough that she knows where I carry the weight of it. And she has said things to me in those conversations that were true and gently delivered and that I received imperfectly because receiving truth gently delivered is something I have always been better at, in theory than in practice. She said once, not unkindly, that I had spent our children's childhoods treating the family like a project I was managing from a slight remove rather than a life I was living from the inside, and I sat with that for a long time after she said it, and I have never fully argued with it because I think it is accurate in a way that I find painful and important to acknowledge. The career gave me things I valued and needed. I do not want to reduce it to a simple villain in the story of my life, because it was not that. It was a genuine and meaningful part of who I was, and the work I did had real value. And I am not prepared to dismiss 40 years of effort as simply misplaced priority. But I also know that it took things, real and specific things, from the people who were closest to me and who deserved more of me than they consistently got. And the taking happened gradually, and without any single dramatic moment of choice. The way erosion happens, so slowly that you do not notice what is being worn away until you look back across enough time to see the shape of what is gone. Somewhere around the 8-month mark, I decided that waiting for things to improve on their own was a strategy that had not been working and was unlikely to start working, and I made a decision that felt significant at the time and that I now understand was less a single decision than the beginning of a long and uneven process of figuring out what a purposeful retired life could actually look like for a man like me. Which is to say, a man who had organized his entire sense of self around professional achievement and who was now having to construct something meaningful out of entirely different materials. I want to be honest about this process because I think the honest version is more useful than the version where a man tries a few things and finds his rhythm and everything gradually slots into place with a satisfying and narrative tidiness, because that was not how it went for me. And I suspect it is not how it goes for most people who are working through something this fundamental. What actually happened was slower and messier and more trial and error than any clean narrative would suggest, and the things that eventually helped were not always the things I expected would help, and some of the things I was most confident would help turned out to be nearly useless, and the whole process required a patience with myself that did not come naturally to a man who had spent 4 decades expecting results from effort on a timeline he could predict and manage. The first thing I tried was a more structured approach to the activities I had already been doing in a loose and uncommitted way, specifically the walking and the occasional fishing and the reading that had been part of my retirement from the beginning, but that I had been doing without any real intention behind them, the way you do things when you are filling time rather than investing it. I bought a proper pair of walking shoes and committed to a daily walk of at least 45 minutes regardless of the weather, and I held to that commitment with the same discipline I had brought to professional obligations for 38 years, and the walking helped in the most basic and physical sense, got me outside and moving and gave the morning a fixed point to organize itself around, and I am grateful for it and still do it every day. But I also recognized fairly quickly that the walking alone was not going to be sufficient, that what I was really missing was not physical activity, but engagement, the specific quality of being genuinely involved in something that required my attention and my judgment and my effort over a sustained period, and a daily walk, however beneficial in other respects, was not going to provide that. I signed up for a course at the local university, a continuing education class on American architectural history that met once a week on Tuesday evenings, and I want to tell you that this surprised me, both the signing up for it and the effect it had. I had not sat in a classroom in nearly 40 years, and I felt genuinely awkward about it in the first session in a way that I had not anticipated, self-conscious in the way that a 66-year-old man sitting among a group of mostly younger continuing education students can feel self-conscious, aware of being out of place in a way that reminded me uncomfortably of the invisible quality I had been experiencing in public since retirement. But the subject matter caught me in a way I had not expected. The history of how buildings are designed and why they look the way they look, and what they say about the people and the times that produced them, and I found myself doing something I had not done in a classroom since engineering school, which was actually caring about what the instructor was saying and wanting to understand it, rather than simply needing to pass the exam. I went home after that first session and looked things up that had been mentioned in class, followed threads of interest that the lecturer had opened up, and spent 2 hours reading about Louis Sullivan and the Chicago School that I had not planned to spend, and that passed quickly in the way that hours pass when you are genuinely interested in what you're doing rather than merely occupying yourself with it. I took that course, and then signed up for another one the following semester, this one on the history of American cities, and the Tuesday evenings became one of the fixed points of my week in a way that the walking had become in the mornings, a reliable structure that gave the days around it a shape they had been lacking. I also returned to fishing with a seriousness that the retirement fantasy had promised and that I had not yet delivered on, largely because in the early months of retirement my energy and motivation had not been equal to the organizational effort that proper fishing requires. I joined a local fly fishing club, something I had never done before, and that required me to learn techniques I had not previously used, and the learning curve of it, the genuine difficulty of acquiring a new skill from something close to scratch at 66, turned out to be exactly the kind of engagement I had been looking for, without knowing that was what I was looking for. There is something about learning a physical skill as an older man that is both humbling and quietly invigorating, the combination of the body's honest limitations and the mind's stubborn insistence on improvement producing a kind of focused attention that I had not experienced in a long time, and that I found I had missed without knowing I had been missing it. I went out with the club most Saturday mornings through the spring and into the summer, standing in cold water before 8 in the morning with men I was gradually coming to know, and the fishing itself was meditative in a way that helped with the internal noise that had been a constant companion since retirement, the circular and unproductive thinking that the long quiet days had been feeding. The club also gave me something that I had been losing since retirement without fully acknowledging the loss, which was regular contact with a group of people who were glad to see me show up, not because they needed anything from me professionally, but simply because I was a member of the group and my presence was a normal and expected part of the Saturday morning. And the simplicity and unconditionality of that welcome was something I found more nourishing than I would have predicted. Through the fishing club, I met a man named Howard Baxter, 71 years old, retired school teacher who had been fly fishing for 30 years and who had a patience with beginners that I suspected was related to decades of teaching teenagers, and that expressed itself in a willingness to show me things multiple times without any visible frustration when I failed to execute them correctly on the first or second or fifth attempt. Howard became a genuine friend over the course of that year in the way that friendships form later in life, when they form at all, slowly and without urgency, built from accumulated shared time rather than from the intensity of younger connections, and our Saturday mornings on the water and the occasional weekday coffee that grew out of them became some of the most consistently good hours of my retired week. I also started doing something that I had been resistant to for reasons I am slightly embarrassed to examine too closely, which was volunteering. My resistance had been rooted in a snobbery I did not fully own at the time, but that I recognize clearly now, a vague sense that volunteering was a lesser form of contribution, something you did when you no longer had anything more substantial to offer, which is both wrong and somewhat revealing about the value system I had been operating inside for 40 years. I eventually let that resistance go, largely because Howard volunteered one morning a week at a literacy program at the public library and mentioned it in a way that was entirely without pressure or evangelism, and that somehow made it easier to consider than if someone had been actively encouraging me toward it. I signed up to help adults with basic reading and writing skills. One morning a week, 2 hours, working one-on-one with people who were learning things that I had taken for granted since childhood, and I want to tell you that those 2 hours became the most consistently meaningful part of my week in a way that nothing else in my retired life had yet managed to be. There was nothing ambiguous about the usefulness of it. There was a person in front of me who needed help with something specific, and I was providing that help in a way that was making a real and measurable difference in that person's life, and the directness and the clarity of that transaction fed something in me that the hollow mornings and the long afternoons had been starving for months. I cannot point to a specific morning and tell you that was the day things changed, because it did not happen that way, and I think by this point in my life I have enough experience with how real change actually moves through a person to know that the clean turning point is mostly a story we tell afterward to make the journey sound more navigable than it felt while we were inside it. What I can tell you is that sometime in the second year of retirement, gradually and without announcement, the quality of the mornings began to shift in a way that I noticed first as an absence of something rather than a presence of something. Specifically, the absence of that hollow, deflating feeling that had greeted me every day for the better part of a year when I woke up and remembered that there was nothing specific requiring my attention. The feeling did not disappear entirely, and I am not sure it ever will entirely, but it thinned out, became less constant and less heavy, began to show up on some mornings and not others rather than every morning without exception, and the mornings when it did not show up had a quality to them that I want to try to describe accurately because I think the accuracy matters. They did not feel triumphant or resolved or arrived at in any dramatic sense. They felt ordinary in a way that was different from the painful ordinariness of the difficult months. A quieter and more settled kind of ordinary. The ordinary of a day that has a shape to it, and that I am moving through with something that resembles intention rather than endurance. The Tuesday morning at the library had become a fixed and genuine anchor of the week, something I looked forward to with a specificity that was different from the vague anticipatory hope I had brought to most retirement activities in the early months. I had been working with the same man for several months, a 53-year-old named Gerald who had grown up without consistent schooling and who was learning to read with a determination and a dignity that I found quietly extraordinary, and watching Gerald work through a page of text that would have taken me 30 seconds, and that took him 20 careful minutes, watching the concentration on his face and the way he would stop and go back and try again without complaint or self-pity, I learned something about persistence and about the relationship between effort and dignity that I do not think I did not and well have at it bond in my waith. I thought about my own adjustment to retirement differently after those mornings with Gerald, thought about the difficulty of learning something new and uncomfortable, with less patience for my own struggle than I had for his, and the thinking was useful in a way that I did not expect and that I am grateful for. Margaret and I had a conversation in the early spring of the second year that I think of as the closest thing to a real turning point I can identify, not because it resolved anything dramatically, but because something was said in it that reframed something I had been looking at from the wrong angle for a long time. We were sitting on the back porch on one of the first genuinely warm evenings of the year, the kind of evening that arrives in Ohio in late April and feels like a gift after the long gray winter, and I said something out loud that I had been carrying internally for months, which was that I still felt, most days, like I was waiting for retirement to become what I had expected it to be, and that the waiting was exhausting in a way that was different from any exhaustion I had experienced during my working years, because at least the working exhaustion had been in the service of something. Margaret was quiet for a moment in the way she is quiet when she is thinking about how to say something carefully, and then she said that she thought maybe the waiting itself was the problem, that I had spent 40 years being a man who was always moving toward the next thing, and that retirement had removed the next thing, and that retirement had removed the next thing, and I had responded by manufacturing a version of it in my head, a future retirement that would finally feel the way I expected it to feel, and that as long as I was waiting for that future retirement was not actually living the one I was in. I did not say much in response to that because I was sitting with it and recognizing how precisely it described something I had not been able to see clearly from inside it. And we sat there on the porch for a while in the comfortable silence of people who have been together long enough that silence requires no management, and the evening light moved across the yard in that slow April way, and the neighborhood was quiet except for someone's wind chimes a few houses down, and a dog barking somewhere in the distance, and I thought about what she had said and felt dramatically, not with eloquent, and sat but what it would see Jack odd. The acceptance that came, and it did come, slowly and without ceremony, was not the acceptance of defeat, and it was not the acceptance of a lesser life than I had deserved or expected. It was something more honest and more useful than either of those things, which was the acceptance of the life I was actually living as sufficient on its own terms, not measured against the life I had lived before, or the retirement I had imagined in advance, but taken as it was, with its genuine pleasures and its real limitations and its quiet rhythms and its specific and irreplaceable people. I was 67 years old, and I had a Tuesday morning that mattered to me, and a Saturday on the water with Howard, and a wife who had stayed beside me through 40 years of my imperfect presence, and 3 children who called, and grandchildren who ran toward me in backyards, and a house that was paid for, and a body that still worked well enough to walk 45 minutes every morning, regardless of the weather. That was not nothing. That was, I came to understand, quite a lot. The identity question, the one that had been underneath all of it from the beginning, the question of who I was, without the professional structure that had defined me for so long, did not resolve itself into a clean answer. I do not think it was supposed to. I think what happened instead was that the question became less urgent, less the kind of thing that woke me up at 3 in the morning and demanded resolution, and more the kind of thing that I carried with some equanimity as an honest and open question about what the final chapter of a life looks like when it is being lived from the inside, rather than imagined from the outside. I was still working on the answer. I think I will be working on it for the rest of my life, and I have made a kind of peace with that, the peace of a man who has learned, later than he should have, but not too late to matter, that some questions are worth carrying rather than solving. I want to speak to you directly for a few minutes, and I want to do it without pretending that I have arrived at some elevated position of understanding that qualifies me to instruct anyone about anything. I have not. What I have is the experience of having gone through something difficult and specific and common in the sense that I know from the conversations I have had with other men of my generation that the thing I experienced is not unusual, not a personal failing or an individual weakness, but a very human response to a very significant transition that our culture tends to celebrate loudly and prepare people for very poorly. So what I want to share is not wisdom in the grand sense, but simply what I have learned from being inside this particular experience for long enough to have developed some perspective on it, offered in the hope that it might be useful to someone who is either approaching what I went through or currently in the middle of it. The first thing I want to say is that the loss of professional identity in retirement is a real loss, and it deserves to be treated as one. I spent too long in the early months trying to argue myself out of the difficulty, telling myself that a man who had worked hard and provided well and reached the end of a long career in decent shape had no legitimate reason to struggle with the reward that career had earned him. That argument was wrong, and it was costly because it prevented me from acknowledging what was actually happening clearly enough to do anything useful about it. If you are struggling with the transition into retirement, or if you are watching someone you love struggle with it, the struggling is not ingratitude and it is not weakness, and it does not mean that something has gone wrong with the person or with the retirement itself. It means that a significant loss has occurred, and that loss is working its way through a person in the way that losses do, on their own timeline and with their own requirements. Give it the dignity of acknowledgement rather than the indignity of dismissal. The second thing I want to say is about identity, specifically about the danger of building your entire sense of self inside a single structure. I built mine inside my career, thoroughly and without adequate awareness of what I was doing. And when the career ended, the identity question that followed was severe and disorienting in ways I had not prepared for. If you are in your 50s and still working and reading this, I would encourage you to think carefully about who you are, outside of what you do, not as a retirement planning exercise, but as a genuine and ongoing investment in the parts of yourself that will still be there after the job is gone. The hobbies and the friendships and the interests and the relationships that you tend carefully during your working years are not peripheral to your life. They are the infrastructure of the self that retirement will require you to live inside, and the more robust that infrastructure is, when you arrive at retirement, the less disorienting the arrival is likely to be. I learned this too late to apply it preventively, but not too late to act on it after the fact, and the acting on it after the fact, while harder and slower than I would have liked, was possible and was worth doing. The third thing is about connection, and I say this as a man who is naturally private and who had to be pushed toward this understanding by the difficulty of the alternative. Human connection is not optional for a good life at any age, and in retirement it requires active maintenance, in a way it did not during your working years when the professional structure provided it more or less automatically. You have to be intentional about it. You have to show up for things even when the inertia of the quiet house and the comfortable chair argues against showing up, because the inertia will always argue against showing up, and if you listen to it, you will find yourself increasingly isolated in a way that compounds every other difficulty retirement presents. It does not matter much what the connection looks like. A fishing club or a literacy program, or a Tuesday class at the community college, or a standing lunch with an old friend or a volunteer shift at a place that needs what you have to offer. The specific form is less important than the regularity and the realness of it. Show up consistently and the connection will build itself around the showing up. The fourth thing I want to say is for the people who love someone going through this transition, the spouses and the children and the close friends who are watching from the outside and who may not fully understand what they are watching. What you are watching is not a man being ungrateful for his retirement or failing to enjoy what he earned. What you are watching, in many cases, is a man trying to rebuild a sense of self from materials he has never had to work with before, in a silence he has never had to inhabit before, without a map and without much cultural permission to talk openly about how hard it actually is. The most useful thing you can offer is not advice and not cheerful encouragement and not gentle suggestions about activities he might try. The most useful thing is patient and non-judgmental presence, the willingness to sit with someone in a difficulty without rushing them through it, which is the same thing that has always been the most useful thing one human being can offer another, and which retirement does not change. It is a Tuesday morning as I sit here telling you all of this, which feels appropriate somehow. Tuesday having become over the past 2 years a day that carries more meaning for me than it used to. The day of the library and Gerald and the particular satisfaction of those 2 hours that has become one of the steadiest and most reliable good things in my week. The morning light is coming through the kitchen window at a low winter angle. pale and clean and sharp in the way that winter light in Ohio has when the sky is clear and it is laying a long rectangle across the kitchen table that moves almost imperceptibly as the sun climbs, and I have been watching it move while I have been sitting here thinking about everything I have just told you, turning it over, one more time in the way that you turn things over when you have been living with them, long enough that turning has become a kind of habit. Margaret is upstairs getting ready for her day. I can hear her moving around up there, the particular sounds of her morning routine that I have been hearing for 41 years, and that are as familiar to me as my own breathing, and there is a comfort in those sounds that I do not take for granted the way I once took most comfortable things for granted. Because one of the genuine gifts of the difficulty I have been describing is that it taught me to notice what I have with a specificity and a gratitude that the forward momentum of a working life never quite allowed. I think about the man I was 3 years ago walking out of that building for the last time with his box of personal items and his plaque, and the warm sound of applause following him through the lobby, and I feel for that man in a way that is tender and a little protective, the way you feel for a younger version of yourself who is about to walk into something he is not prepared for, and whom you cannot warn because the past does not work that way. He had done good work, and he deserved the send-off, and he was genuinely ready for the rest that retirement promised. And he had no way of knowing that the rest would turn out to be the hardest work of his life. The internal and unglamorous and entirely unwitnessed work of figuring out who he was, when the thing that had told him who he was for 38 years was no longer there to answer that question. I think he did what he could with what he had, that man. I think he struggled honestly and without much self-pity, and eventually found his way to something real, not the golden retirement he had pictured from the other side of all those early mornings and long road trips and hotel rooms, but something better than the picture in certain ways, because it was actual rather than imagined, and because it had been earned through genuine difficulty rather than simply arrived at through the passage of time. The fishing is good now. I want to say that simply because it is true, and because the simplicity of it matters. Howard and I were out on the river 2 Saturdays ago, in weather that was colder than either of us would have chosen if the choice had been purely about comfort, standing in moving water in the early morning with our breath making small clouds in the cold air, and I made a cast that went exactly where I intended it to go, in a way that still surprises me when it happens, and the fly settled on the water with a lightness that felt like something I actually earned rather than stumbled into, and I stood there in the cold river watching it drift and felt a contentment that was quiet and entirely sufficient. No applause, no one watching, no metric by which to measure it except the feeling itself, and the feeling was good, and I let it be good without reaching for anything more than what it was. Patrick called last Sunday, and we talked for 40 minutes, longer than our calls usually go, and somewhere in the middle of it the conversation found its way to something real, something beneath the surface, facts of each other's weeks, and I listened to my son in a way that I think I am finally learning to listen, without the part of my attention that used to be reserved for formulating my response while the other person was still talking, and it was a good conversation, genuinely good, and when it ended I sat with the goodness of it for a while, instead of moving attention, and the not moving was a kai, was there was seffing, but as though biting in a quiet. I'm 70 years old. I do not know how much time is left, and I have made a certain peace with not knowing, the kind of peace that is not resignation, but is something closer to acceptance in the truest sense of that word, the acceptance of a man who has looked at what his life actually is and found it, honestly and without requiring it to be more than it is, to be enough. That is where I am. That is what I have found on the other side of the silence that nobody warned me about. Not triumph, not a conclusion, just a Tuesday morning, with good light through the window and coffee that is still warm, and the sound of my wife moving around upstairs and a day ahead of me that has a shape to it, and that I intend to move through with the presence and the attention that it deserves. If you have stayed with me through all of this, through the difficult mornings and the quiet phone, and the long afternoons and the slow and uneven process of finding something solid to stand on again, then I want you to know that I am genuinely grateful for your company in a way that is not a formality. There is something about telling a story this honestly, without the polished edges and the tidy resolution, that requires someone willing to sit with the unpolished version, and you have done that, and it means something to me that I find difficult to adequately express, but that I want to try to express anyway because I think the trying matters. Before I let you go, I want to leave you with one question, and I want to ask it, as honestly as I have tried to tell this story without any rhetorical intention behind it, just as a real question that I have been sitting with myself and that I think is worth sitting with, if you are anywhere near the season of life I have been describing, or if you love someone who is. The question is this: when the structure that has held your days together for most of your adult life is finally gone, when the role that told you who you were and where you belonged and why your presence in the world mattered is no longer there to provide those answers, who are you then, and is that person someone you have taken any time to know? I do not ask that to unsettle you. I ask it because I wish someone had asked it of me 10 years before I needed the answer, quietly and without urgency, while there was still time to do some of the knowing in advance rather than all of it under pressure. If any part of this story felt true to something you have lived or are living or can see approaching on the horizon of your own life, I hope it gave you something useful to carry, even if that something is simply the knowledge that the feeling you have been moving through is not yours alone, that other people have sat in the same quiet kitchen, in the same early morning light, with the same unanswerable questions, and have found their way, slowly and imperfectly, to something worth calling a life. If you would like to hear more stories told this way, honest and unhurried and from the inside of a real human experience rather than the outside of one, it would mean a great deal if you would consider subscribing to this channel, not because the number matters for its own sake, but because every person who subscribes is saying that this kind of storytelling deserves to continue, and that quiet encouragement is what makes the continuing possible. Thank you for listening. Take good care of yourself out there.